Okay, so here is our finished track. It is the track from the beginning of our intro. It's called 7 Up. I'm going to play it for you with the master on and then off, and we're going to jump right into it, starting with the drums.
Reese's Pieces, 7 Up. Mess with me and I'll mess you up. 7 Up.
Okay, and so the reason why I wanted you to hear that is because there is a obviously vast difference in the master than there is the mix. And if you're doing something like this from home, you want the mix to sound pretty decent from just the mix standpoint. It doesn't need to sound mastered, but there's different ways of mixing and mastering. The way that I prefer to do it is I just want everything to sound as good as I can get it, perfectly in its place, and then when I have the master on, it just snaps everything together. And we're going to talk about different ways to do that. So in this section here, I'm going to open up the drums, and the first thing that we want to talk about is the kick. The most important part of your song, it's not necessarily the drop lead or anything like that, but it's going to be the sound of your kick. And something that I recommend to you is go to your song, the one that you're working on from home right now. Take a look at your kick, and what you want to notice is the length of the kick. Now, every song is different, but the thing that you want to notate is that a long kick isn't going to help your song. You want to make enough room in this space here for your low end and for the body of the rest of the song. And you can make this part sound as big as you want it to be, as fat as you want it to be, but you want it to be short and then get out of the way. Lingering kicks are not a good thing to have. And one way to actually help that is to put your kick down to audio and literally just cut it. Just cut out the garbage that you don't need, put a fade on it. Speaking of fades, I highly recommend that you go to your preferences by pressing Command, comma, pull up your preferences. And something I commonly have on is create fades on clip edges. This is going to help a lot with little pops and crackles throughout your song. Now, when you're scattering your drums, it's going to be a little bit of a nuisance. But you just go to the first hit, like let's say you're doing your kick or your snare or your loop. It's actually probably good to have it on your hi-hat loop. And just make sure that that fade isn't lingering like that before you start duplicating it across. That's the number one thing you want to make sure to do, is to make sure you don't have that fade. But the reason I mention this is because once your song is all said and done, unless you're sitting there and you're listening to every single track individually, you might not be hearing these pops that are happening because there's so much other music going on. But those pops can make your song sound kind of whack. Let's just take a listen to how the drums sound just on their own. So you probably could figure this part out on your own, but everything is kind of side-chained to each other. There's also a very important part of this kick, and this is something that you should do right away by going into your song right now, and it's layering a white noise underneath your kick. This is going to help the wideness and bigness of your kick. If I were to take an imager and play that back with the imager on, let's take a look at that. This is going to be just the kick, and then I'm going to turn on our white noise layer. So as you can see, it's still in the middle. it's still technically mono, but it's a lot wider, and you can get creative with it, and you can turn on I'm using this widener right now. I didn't mention it earlier because I don't recommend it for a lot of things, but something like white noise, it's fine, because the whole purpose of this is to give the kick more energy on a bigger, wider spectrum than just in the middle, so that when you hear that kick, when everything else is sidechaining down, it sounds really wide and big, but we're not compromising the mono frequencies. So you could use the S1 or any other imager you have to make this as wide as you want. Let's hear it with and without this. So if you're on your laptop, you might not hear the difference, but there's definitely a difference. And in the grand scheme of things, if I were to play this with this on in the song, in the mix, let's hear how that sounds.
Seven up.
So you can tell that it really brings out the brilliance of the kick with it on. Now in the master, it's going to sound different with everything mastered, everything compressed down. That's going to be a little bit different of a vibe, but you can definitely hear how it makes the kick sound more prominent and wider. The reason I have it down at negative 28 dB in volume is because I don't want people to know it's there. It's like an energy thing, and I'm not using the widener on this part right now because I don't want it to be the forefront. I just need a little bit extra energy. And again, notice the EQ here. We don't need to have anything below like 400, 360 hertz. It's just not necessary. So we're gonna just cut that out. It's just to give a little bit more energy to it all. So I recommend to you, if you don't already have something like this underneath your kick, to go ahead and try it out right now and put that in your song. But I wouldn't recommend doing it over the clap section or the snare, just because you probably don't need it. It's not something that's required for that section. Another thing too, if you were to go over here and look at things like, this is the clap, okay? Notice, I don't know if any of you guys ever use this section here. This is the track delay section. There's different ways to do this, and I know there's more delays in here somewhere. So offsetting drums and instruments from one another is very important. What this actually does is it has the sound play just a millisecond later, and it'll sound louder. If you do this, let's say you do it to your bass. I'm pretty sure I'm doing it to the bass, and we'll check that out in a minute. It'll sound louder because it's not playing at the exact same time as the kick or the snare or whatever the instrument is. As much time and space offset that you can do with your instruments, the more organic your song will sound, the better it will sound, the more space your song will have. Let's hear what these two sound like, the kick and the snare, with it at 1 millisecond and then with it offset. So you can tell when they're on top of each other. It doesn't sound bad at all, but it's these small little nuances and details that are going to make your song work better in the master. And what happens is your speakers, they got a lot of work to do when they're playing a song back. So we're just making it that much easier for our speakers to have time and room to breathe in order to be able to play each instrument to the fullest of its potential. If you have two things layered on top of each other and they're playing at the same time, you might have a little bit of difficulty. Let's jump back into the kick for a second. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through the EQ section and the limiting section that I have for our kick. So what I notice when I take this off is the kick sounds just a little bit more dead to me. It sounds cool, but it sounds like just a kind of a little bit flat. And these EQ moves, like cutting this, why am I cutting around 500 hertz? That's because that's where your vocals, that's where your instrumentation will generally sit. So I want to scoop this out a little bit so that it makes extra room for those other instruments to have the necessary air and room it needs to breathe. I don't want these frequencies to be louder than my drum. And I'm also rolling off the low end here at about 30 hertz. You can go higher. You can definitely go higher. That's not going to hurt you at all. And sometimes if you give it a little bump here, that will make up for what you lost here. These are things you should be trying on your drum right now. And one more thing that I forgot to mention earlier, you should definitely be flattening down as much of your instrumentation as possible for better playback. It'll sound better. Committing to the sounds, you can always go back to an older version and say, hey, I'm going to re-bring in that instrument. I messed it up somewhere along the way, and you can re-import it. Another thing too is I don't want the top end of my kick to be too harsh and slap too hard, to be honest with you. So let's take a listen to this EQ with and without it. Such a small but great difference. We're cutting out the things we don't need, right? And then we're just keeping the parts that we like. Again, you need to do this within the track. I'm just showing you with it on solo. I don't recommend doing all these moves on solo. I'm just showing you what I do and what are the common things that I see every time. I know when I'm EQing a kick for the mixing portion of my production that these are the common things I'm going to be doing. This right here is actually a really important part. This is the drive on a kick. You might saturate your drums, which is good. But adding a little bit of bite and sparkle to your kick, your snare, whatever needs it, this is going to help drive it. Remember, the kick is the most important part of your song. Let's take a listen to this with and without. Okay, so if you have a driver, you can use the Ableton driver if you want. There, I never use it, but this can do the exact same thing. You just pop that baby on and you're good to go. I'm not going to do all those demonstrations for you because we got way too much stuff to cover. But if you don't have Shaperbox, which I do recommend buying if you don't have it, then go ahead and get yourself Overdrive. Let's listen to this in conjunction with the mix so we can really get an idea of what it does. So that difference is small but great. It's really important, if you ask me, to be able to have that in your song to give your drum more life and visibility or audibility for the final mix and master of the song. Now let's jump over to soothe. This is going to be an important aspect and one of the most common things that you're going to do. So what do I have going on here? We have a side chain to the clap, and then this button is also on. We have an EQ move here. Oops, I messed it up. Come on, bruh. There it is. Okay, so we have an EQ cutting around 400 hertz. Okay, you can see that here, because what we're doing is when that clap happens, we want the kick and the clap to work in conjunction, but we don't want the frequencies of the kick to conflict with the frequencies of the clap. You're probably like, I never thought of sidechaining the clap and the kick together. You normally wouldn't do this because they don't play on top of each other unless you're doing house music. All of these things that I'm showing you can go for any style of music, but if you have two instruments on top of each other, this is how you do it. Don't just go to the clap and cut out a bunch of sound. Don't go to the kick and just EQ out a bunch of sound. Use a sidechain to only hone in the frequencies that need to be removed for that specific instance. Let's take a listen before and after. So what you're probably hearing is that when it turns on, the clap becomes the lead of that section, and that's what we want. We want the bottom end of the kick, but then we also want the clap to be the forefront of that part of the song whenever it happens. And this can be done with any instrument. This is probably one of the most important pieces of advice that I'm going to be giving you throughout this entire tutorial. You need Soothe or something comparable, like the Pro MB does something of the similar thing, but it doesn't do it the way that it does it here, where it like only does it to specific frequencies. There's like some kind of algorithm with it that allows it to do it. I'm not going to be doing a tutorial on every single one of these plugins. If you need to learn more about the plugin, then watch a tutorial on that. This tutorial is supposed to show you what it is you need to know to make your stuff sound better. And this Soothe is doing the exact same thing, but there's two different claps in my song. This isn't really a production tutorial, but that's one clap, and then the other clap is actually down here, which comes in after it, because I think it's smart to have different tones of claps and drums throughout your song, so the drums actually keep evolving. It's not stale. So what's going on with this limiter is pretty straightforward. I prefer a transparent style of limiting where it doesn't really color the sound as much, giving it a few dB bump. That's obvious stuff. The look ahead is important. Having it all the way down is going to make everything more in your face, but it could be at the cost of clipping if you're not paying attention. The attack being late helps us with our low end register. We don't want to crush those transients at the beginning for this one. That should have been something you do within the compression amongst the tracks individually. The attack being late is primarily just so that you can squeeze the transient and the resonation, or the length of the transient, and bring down that dynamic range more, making it more level. And then I just have an average release here, nothing crazy. And one more thing I'd like to mention is that as you see me pull up these plugins, as you see me pull up these racks, feel free to pause the video, recreate what you're seeing in my settings, and save that as a rack that you can refer to later. Any of these things I'm showing you, you can pretty much drop on any track and then tweak and adjust. This is going to help you expedite things, and you can do this at any stage in your production. And then this right here is nothing. All right, let's go on to here and let's check out Spiff, because this is what helps bring things together. And all this does is this is adding a boost. You can do the opposite. It's like a Pro MB almost, but it's more about the transient and the way that the transients are hitting. You can even see that actually right here. It says set Spiff to either cut or boost the transients. That's all it's doing. So instead of boosting the EQ, you're just doing a transient push. Let's see what it sounds like with and without Spiff on. And this is going to be over the entire kick and white noise and the clap. So in my opinion, this plugin is completely saving the sound of the kick and clap section. If you notice the distortion that happens that's coming from the driver in the kick really is prominent without spiff on, and it's really leveling everything out in just such a nice way. So you can use this in all kinds of different ways. The way we're using it here is we're using it to push that 100 bump on the kick, because when that hits, we really want that to shine versus having the other elements like the clap and the white noise being prominent. So everything's a balance. So if you thought of this as a teeter-totter, the low end being here, every time the low end hits, we want that to be just a little bit more than everything else. Spiff is definitely a perfect tool for you to have. You can use it on anything, even vocals. This is like the build up, but before the build actually starts happening, we have this like kind of hip hop-ish breakdown section. I'm just going to loop this real quick and let's listen to it with and without spiff. Okay, so that's pretty apparent. You can really hear the way that the punch of the drum is driving this section. That's really important. Another thing too, let's take a look at this. This is something I might have overlooked myself because I don't see any kind of sidechain happening on this section. Now, I've been listening to this song for a while and it sounds to be pretty fine, but I'm willing to bet if you put a little sidechain action here, this would probably sound even better. And one way I like to do sidechains, which you might want to try out, is just using a fade on it, because that's all it is. That's all a sidechain is just volume. And sometimes just throwing a quick fade on something will actually do the trick versus like putting on another plugin. You could be a little bit more meticulous on things, on how it sounds. Let's just do it on a little bit of this real quick and see how we like it a little bit better. I'm only doing it to the kick, by the way. And manual things like this are really good because you have more control. Let's hear that now. I kind of like both ways. I'm going to just leave it the way that it was. But if you notice, that kick popped out way harder. We don't really need any extra business happening over that kick section. Now I'm going to turn this on for a quick second. The important thing to notice here is how wide the sound of this instrument is, whereas the kick is in the middle. So it wouldn't really affect it in the speaker sense in general because of the placement in the sound spectrum. As a producer, they'll tell you, most people will say, it's all about your sound selection. And what I mean by that is, let's just say you finish your song, okay? And you think it sounds really good because you're really used to the drums. You're used to the kick. You're used to the way that the drums sound. You think it sounds really good. You love it, right? What if, when you're all done with your song, you replaced your entire drum just to see how it sounds? And the reason I bring that up is because the way that your drum sounds is the most important part in your song. I've been saying that. And if you change out your drum, your song is going to have a whole different timbre. So what I prepared down here is just a few different drum variations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the drums. And I'm going to turn on this other drum. It's got different hi-hats in it. Didn't even bother EQing it. It's got 4 different kicks. Let's just play through this with the entirety of the song. I'm not going to play it with the master because I didn't tweak the master to work with this new drum or tweak the drum to work with the master. Let's just take a listen to how it changes the song. think we can stop it right there. Now there's some good kick options in here. I think this one here the second one sounded kind of puffy, just like the one I already have. It's just a little bit different. It doesn't have the body dynamics that I was looking for. This one actually sounds pretty awesome. And the reason I bring this up is because if you're working in your song right now and it sounds pretty good, you might want to try to check out your kick and change it out with a few other ones and just see how it sounds. There's been so many times where I'll make a song and then when I change out the kick, I'm like, oh, yeah, that's the sound I'm looking for. And why do I say this? Is because when you start your song, you probably start off with your drums. You build your drums and you build the rest of the instruments. You think that these instruments sound great with this specific drum, so you rock it and you're like, this is my song. But then you change out that kick from a totally different perspective. You're now making the kick in conjunction with the rest of your song, the rest of your instruments. And then this gives your song a new life. You're giving it a second chance to be the best it can. And sometimes you don't find a better kick, which is cool. I didn't for this one personally, though I will say I do like this kick in here, but it's not the sound that I want. I'm loving the way that everything has been sounding. But let's hear this kick versus the old kick. So the reason why I'm sticking with my original kick versus this one, even though it is great, is because I want a really soft sound. If you produce your song well, you're not going to have to do a lot of stuff. You're probably thinking there's not that much to these drums to make them sound good. And that's because I did the hard work in the production stage. You should definitely look at that portion of, the project when you're producing the sounds you choose. If you choose good sounds, the less work you're going to have to do later on. So let's just check out this last little section before we get into the rest of this. And I hope you guys have been going back and forth between your own songs and making these changes. Oh, and one more thing that I forgot to mention. This is a production thing. That's why I didn't mention it, because it's already been done. Go to your hi-hats and offset your hi-hats a little bit to the right or left. If you have two hi-hats, one to the right, one to the left, do it up to I would say even 15 to the left, 15 to the right, up to that. And use some sort of panner. Again, this is like the production stage. An auto panner is perfectly fine. And you don't want to do a crazy amount of auto panning. You want to do enough panning so that the sound doesn't sound stagnant in the same place. Even something like this is cool, and you can set it to be I don't know, a quarter or 2 bars, 1 bar. It doesn't really matter as long as the hi-hat isn't staying exactly in the same place. So let's listen to this next portion real quick.
7 up.
Okay, so you probably noticed when I turned off the Pro MB, the kick and everything sounded sick, that much bigger and better. That's an illusion. If you continue to work on your drum and you think that it's going to sound amazing because I'm making every instrument sound huge, you're going to have a problem later on down the road. I've done it a million times, trust me. You might be sitting there thinking you're going to do it the best. You're better than everyone else. Your drum is going to sound amazing, or your bass is going to sound amazing. The problem is that's one piece of the puzzle, and you need the rest of the pieces of the puzzle to agree. So in this scenario, we're using the Pro MB in this section here to cut and to compress the mid-range, or I'd say, the general low or high mid range of this drum, and then more importantly, the low end. I'm not a big believer on necessarily cutting too much out of your kick. A lot of people will cut up to 50 hertz on their kicks. I don't like doing that at all. I would rather lower the volume of the low on the kick with a compressor, a multi-band compressor, a dynamic multi-band EQ compressor, something of that nature to tame those frequencies. So I'm going to play that back one more time for you, and I want you to really listen to the way that this instrument is affecting the drum. So notice that this is called the mid freak. It says Rix. It's supposed to say fix. And the reason for that is because I've already gone through the hardships for you. This is something that I had to add on later on when I would play my song against another famous song and say, why is mine not sound as good? And this was part of the problem. This is something that happens in every single song. You might as well go ahead and pop this on your mix bus for your drums or your drum group right now. Something of this nature. These settings here are all the basic settings. All I'm doing is just putting it on, playing with the threshold, and bringing it down. Try it out. See how it works for you. I promise you probably won't be mad at the end result. And the reason being is because you just need balance in your song. You don't need your song to destroy the world when it's played. You just need people to enjoy it. Easy listening. And I don't care what the genre is, if it's crazy dubstep. There should be no conflict when you're listening back to the song. Just easy listening. Last but not least, we have a little limiter here. This is just protecting it from clipping in the drum region. That's all. Before we end this portion of the tutorial, I want to show you one thing that I find to be really important, and that correlates to what I was just saying about destroying the world with your song. Here is our master. So I'm going to turn on the master now for a second, and we're going to talk about all this. And I'll actually mention it right now. You know how Ozone has like 5, 6, 7 different modules within itself? I like to have everything separated out just like this. So that's why there's so many plugins on my master. And I don't care what anybody says. You can master your song a million different ways. I've done it where you master the tracks individually, which we'll discuss. I've done it where you do it like this. And it's whatever works for the song or however you produce the song. I also recommend when you're producing your song to have some sort of light master prepared so that you can keep turning it on and off while you're working. This will give you perspective of what the final result will look like. Now, I dealt with a lot with this song to get it to sound the way I wanted to. And it turned out that the biggest problem I had was this mastering plugin. And the problem was these were set to 30. And the reason why they were set to 30 milliseconds, that's what this has to do with 30 milliseconds. The problem with it is I wanted this song to sound freaking huge. That when people would hear the song, they'd have to call their grandmother right after to tell them they heard the biggest song they've ever heard. And instead of worrying about having the song just be right and sounding good, I worried about things like competition. So that clouded my vision. And it took like a month for me to just go like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play it back for you. And I'm going to put it to 30 at first. And then we're going to roll it back to 10. And then you're going to hear the clarity and the difference in the song. Here we go. So, you're probably like, yeah, that was pretty noticeable. It wasn't as noticeable before. And what it allowed me to do is push the limiter way harder. It made the song louder just in general. Keep in mind, the master was at a different stage at that point because I had to work with all the low-end mud that was happening here. But this is a big deal. And I think you should definitely be very careful when you're doing your own masters from home. Don't go above 10 if you can help it. I think that should probably be the max. Commonly amongst all my tracks, I have found that this area is the most you want to go. So hopefully you guys have made some changes to your own personal songs, and hopefully they're sounding even better than they did before you started watching this tutorial. I'll see you guys in the next section.